I do want to talk about, who has the most leverage here, because when you're talking about major players, the majority of people you named are members of the GOP. So, who has the most power? Who has the most leverage? Because it sounds like the GOP is on the offense and Democrats are playing defense.
Yeah, it's a question of who has the most leverage is who's willing to let the government default. I mean, if Republicans aren't willing to let the country default, then their leverage is limited. If Democrats aren't letting the country to default, then their leverage is limited. The problem here is that a lot of politicians take their cues from voters, and voters they don't really understand the debt ceiling, and they frankly don't really care about the debt ceiling, but they do care about the ramifications of what happens if we default on the debt. And in many ways, that harms Democrats because Joe Biden, for better or for worse, he is seen as the one who is kind of blamed or exalted for the economy. And if there is a default, that's a pretty catastrophic situation for the American economy. And who are voters going to blame? I mean, there may be some divide over kind of Republicans and Democrats, but at the end of the day, Joe Biden is president. And it's a very hard position for him if he's planning to run for reelection to deal with an economy that's maybe potentially in a recession, higher unemployment rates. That the last president, the last incumbent to win reelection when there was a recession right before his reelection was over 100 years ago. And that was President McKinley. And so I think in that sense, Republicans do have a bit more leverage here. Now, leverage is limited. That if Republicans are asking for the moon on something like a debt ceiling, I think then they can kind of that negotiations can backfire. But if they're looking for something targeted, or if they kind of find a way to declare victory on some targeted reforms, then I think then they're in a better position than Democrats. But if they kind of backfire and they overshoot, then I think that Democrats have an opening here. You're already seeing them fundraise off of kind of Republican so-called extremism. And if we're kind of in the midst of this debt ceiling fight, and we're kind of almost entering a recession later in the year, I think there's a position for Biden to pin some of the blame of the recession on Republicans and Republican extremism, which is kind of a trope that he's trying to make for his reelection. So there's a balancing act here. I mean, I think there's risks for both parties. And right now, Republicans have a little more leverage in negotiating, but as time goes on and as kind of they struggle perhaps to kind of come up with a negotiating position, I think their leverage decreases and Democrats can kind of feel a little more emboldened.